Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
Growing up in our house was like living inside a snow globe someone shook every time they got bored. It looked pretty from the outside, but inside, everything was just chaos barely contained by a thin glass wall, always on the verge of shattering. My parents, Ruth and Thomas Cole, wore their values like badges of honor pinned to their shirts. Family means sacrifice, they'd say at every birthday, every Sunday dinner, every goddamn PTA meeting where they bragged about how close-knit we were. Family means standing together, no matter what. It was the kind of thing that sounded noble in Christmas cards and church sermons, but when it came to practice, it usually meant Heather sacrifices, Danny benefits. Danny, my younger brother by 2 years, was the golden child, and I do not mean that figuratively. If he farted in church, they'd say the organ music must have set off his delicate stomach. If he crashed the car into Mrs. Donnelly's mailbox, somehow I got grounded for setting a bad example because I once brought home a B in algebra. My brother had the kind of charmed life people write country songs about, the good ones, where nobody's dog dies and every wrong is forgiven by the time the second verse rolls around. I should have seen the pattern earlier, but like most kids desperate for approval, I kept thinking maybe if I just worked a little harder, loved a little louder, they'd notice me too. I played the flute badly for 5 years just because my mom once said she loved hearing music in the house. I took summer jobs at the diner and saved every tip so I could buy my own car, while Danny got a brand new pickup for his 16th birthday, complete with about the size of a toddler strapped to the hood. Family means helping each other, my dad had said when I cried a little too hard at the party. Someday Danny will help you too, you'll see. That day never came. Instead, Danny's messes got bigger and stupider as he grew older. College was a brief pit stop on his way to nowhere. One semester spent more on keg stands than textbooks. Then came a series of business ventures, a landscaping company that lost more lawns than it mowed, a cryptocurrency scam that ended with his bank account frozen and my parents refinancing their house. Every time he crashed and burned, there they were with open arms and open wallets, crowing about how family always stood together, while I stood on the sidelines clenching my teeth so hard it's a miracle I still have molars. I built my life carefully, like someone stacking cards during an earthquake. I finished college, climbed the corporate ladder, learned to say, "Yes, sir," and "No, ma'am," until I had a retirement fund that could actually retire something more than just my dreams. I bought a modest condo 2 towns over, far enough that I could say I had plans whenever they called, but close enough that guilt could still gnaw at me like a stray dog on a bone. I thought, stupidly, that if I just stayed steady, stayed good, they'd eventually see me, appreciate me. Hell, maybe even love me for something other than being the one who didn't need constant rescuing. Then Danny found a new disaster. It started with a voicemail from my mom, her voice sugary sweet but cracking around the edges the way it always did when they needed something. "Honey, it's your mother. Could you give us a call? Nothing urgent, sweetheart. Just a little family thing we'd love your help with. We're so proud of you. Love you." I sat in my car outside the office for a solid 5 minutes before I returned the call, bracing myself like I was about to jump into ice water. Turns out, Danny had taken out a second mortgage on his fixer-upper of a house for some brilliant business idea, flipping jet skis in a town that barely had a swimming pool between all its residents. Now he was about to lose the house, and somehow the only solution they could think of was me. They needed me to co-sign a new loan, something just temporary until Danny could get back on his feet, as if he'd ever had both feet on the ground to begin with. I listened silently as they laid it all out, the familiar notes of manipulation sweetening every word. "You know how important family is, Heather. Danny's just had some bad luck. It would mean so much to us. We always believed in you." I stared out the window at the parking lot, where a teenager was keying someone's car with casual, smiling malice, and realized for the first time that loyalty without respect is just another form of slavery. I let them talk, Let them spin their little fairy tale about how this time would be different. Then I smiled so brightly I could feel it crack my face and said, "Sure, Mom, Dad, of course I'll help. Just let me call my lawyer first." The silence on the other end of the line was louder than a gunshot. The second I hung up the phone with my parents, still hearing their syrupy voices echoing in my head, I knew that I needed to be smart about this, smarter than I had ever been when it came to them. Because deep down I could feel it was no longer just about Danny's reckless stupidity, but about something much bigger, something that had been brewing under the surface for years. I sat there in my car for a long minute, hands clenching the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white, and for the first time, instead of feeling guilt or obligation, I felt a low, simmering anger, the kind that doesn't just burn but refines you into something new, something stronger. Without even thinking, almost on autopilot, I scrolled through my contacts until I found Mr. Whitmore, the lawyer my grandmother had insisted I get to know right before she passed away. My sweet, stubborn Grandma June, a woman who had lived through the Depression, 3 marriages, and raising 2 generations of idiot children, had always said, "Baby, blood's thicker than water." Sure, but so is oil, and oil just makes a mess if you let it spill. I never really understood what she meant when I was younger, but sitting there with my future on the line, I finally got it. When Mr. Whitmore picked up, his voice was as dry and precise as always, like a man who still used a fountain pen and ironed his shoelaces. "Heather," he said, not even asking why I was calling after almost 2 years of radio silence. "I was wondering when you'd need me." I explained the situation to him, stumbling a little at first, trying to stay calm and professional even as my heart beat like a goddamn drum solo in my chest. I told him about the loan, about my parents' request, about Danny's endless string of failures dressed up as learning experiences. I must have talked for 10 straight minutes without breathing, and when I finally stopped, Mr. Whitmore was silent for a moment before he said, with that same coolness that used to drive Grandma June crazy, "You do realize you own the house, don't you?" For a second, I thought maybe I had misheard him, that the buzzing in my ears was messing with my brain because it sounded so insane, so impossible. "What do you mean I own the house?" I asked, feeling that old, familiar pit open up in my stomach, the one I thought I had paved over with degrees and promotions and therapy. Mr. Whitmore explained it all slowly, like he was talking to a child, which honestly, given my stunned silence, was probably appropriate. When Grandma June passed, she had left the family house, the same house my parents still lived in, the one they acted like rulers of, entirely to me. Not to them jointly, not to all her beloved descendants, just me. Apparently, sometime in the haze of dealing with funeral arrangements and inheritance papers, my parents had either never noticed or conveniently ignored the tiny, unassuming document that transferred the deed into my name. Technically, legally, in every way that mattered, the house was mine and had been for almost 3 years now. I sat there dumbfounded, my mind racing through possibilities, emotions swinging wildly between disbelief, rage, and a sick, giddy kind of vindication. I thought about all the times they made me feel like an outsider in my own family, all the times they said, "You'll understand when you're older," while patting Danny on the back for some new, expensive mistake. I thought about how they had thrown around the word sacrifice like it was confetti at a damn wedding, never once realizing I was the one bleeding dry in the corner. And now here I was, sitting on the title to their precious home, the same home they were banking on to bail their golden boy out once again. The irony was so thick I almost choked on it. Mr. Whitmore gently suggested I come into his office to go over the paperwork, but I told him no, not yet. I needed time to think. I needed to figure out exactly what kind of person I was going to be now that the balance of power had shifted so dramatically in my favor. I promised I would call him back in a day or two and hung up, my hands still shaking. For a moment, I just stared at the dashboard, feeling the weight of generations pressing down on me. This house wasn't just a house, it was the battlefield, the prize, the burden. It was the history of every slammed door, every raised voice, every broken promise disguised as a family tradition. And it was mine. It still amazes me how fast your perspective can shift when you realize you hold all the cards. I mean, here I was thinking the house was worth about $200,000, when in reality, after checking the latest market rates online, it was closer to $400,000, double what I had assumed, double the leverage, double the reason to be very, very careful. Most people would probably say this was where I should have called my parents, confessed everything, and worked out some kind of fair agreement like a good little daughter who believed in second chances. But those people never lived in my house. They never saw the way my parents' smiles tightened into sneers the second they smelled weakness. They never learned, the hard way, that love without respect is just another form of control. No, I wasn't going to play by their rules anymore. I wasn't going to be the safety net they cut out from under me whenever it suited them. If they wanted my help, they were going to have to pay for it in a currency they actually valued. I opened my phone, pulled up Danny's number, and typed out a text with fingers that barely shook anymore. Let's talk terms. And then I hit send. The diner Danny picked was the kind of place where the cracked vinyl boots stuck to your skin no matter how much you shifted around, and the smell of grease and burnt coffee had seeped into the walls like a bad memory that nobody wanted to talk about. I knew exactly why he chose it too. It was the kind of place where he felt at home. A little grimy, a little lawless, a little like nobody in their right mind would expect a serious conversation to happen there. Especially one that involved contracts and collateral, and the kind of betrayal that wore a smile like cheap cologne. When I walked in, he was already there, sprawled across one side of the booth like he owned the place, a half-drunk cup of coffee in front of him, and that familiar cocky smirk plastered across his face like he was about to close some million-dollar deal instead of beg his sister to save his sorry ass. He looked up when he saw me and flashed that same smile he used to charm every teacher, every cop, every poor girl who thought she was going to fix him, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel a single flicker of affection in response, just a hard, cold knot of determination sitting heavy in my gut. "Hey, sis," he said, like we were meeting for Sunday brunch, and not a desperate bailout. "Thanks for coming. Figured you'd see reason once you cooled off a little." I slid into the booth across from him, ignoring the way the seat squealed under my weight, and forced a polite smile onto my face, the kind you use when you are 2 seconds away from flipping the table but need to keep your hands clean a little longer. "Of course, Danny," I said, my voice as smooth as the chipped formica under my fingertips. "Family sacrifices for each other, right?" He grinned wider, completely missing the sharp edge under my words, and launched into his pitch like he had been practicing it in the mirror all morning. He talked about second chances, about how hard he had been trying, about how the market was going to turn any day now, and he just needed a little help to hold on until then. He tossed around words like investment and partnership like he thought I was dumb enough to forget every time he had promised the same thing to someone else and then left them holding the bag. I nodded along, let him think he was winning, let him dig the hole a little deeper with every word. When he finally paused to take a breath, I pulled a manila envelope out of my bag and laid it gently on the table between us like it was a loaded gun, which, in a way, it was. His eyes flicked down to it, then back up to me, confusion flickering briefly across his face before he buried it under another smirk. "What's this?" he asked, reaching for it with the casual arrogance of someone who had never, not once in his life, thought there could be consequences for his actions. "Just a few terms," I said lightly, folding my hands on the table. "Nothing complicated. If you want me to co-sign, I need collateral." He laughed, loud and hearty, throwing his head back like I had just told the world's funniest joke, and for a second the entire diner turned to look at us. "Collateral? Jesus, Heather, what is this, a mob movie?" I smiled back at him, all teeth and no warmth. "Something like that." Still chuckling, he flipped open the envelope and started skimming the paperwork inside, his eyes moving fast at first and then slowing, dragging like tires through mud, until finally they stopped completely. The color drained from his face in a way that was almost theatrical, and if I had not spent a lifetime watching him lie and squirm his way out of consequences, I might have felt a twinge of pity. Almost. "You're serious," he said, voice suddenly small in the vast emptiness between us. "Dead serious," I replied, leaning back against the booth and crossing my arms. "The house, Danny. You put it up as collateral. If you default on the loan, I get it." He blinked at me like he was trying to process English as a second language, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly a few times before he finally found words. But Mom and Dad," I cut him off with a sharp shake of my head. "Mom and Dad don't own the house, Danny," I said, keeping my voice calm and even as I felt the giddy, furious satisfaction bubbling up inside me. "They haven't owned it for 3 years." He stared at me, completely blank, and I realized in that moment he truly had no idea. They had all been so wrapped up in their own little world of golden child worship that they had never once thought to check who was actually paying the property taxes, who was actually on the deed. "I do," I said, each word like a hammer driving the nail in deeper. "Grandma left it to me. It's been mine all along." For a long second, Danny just sat there, staring at me like I had grown a second head, and then, right there in that sticky booth under the flickering fluorescent lights, his world started to crumble. And I wasn't about to offer him a hand to steady himself. I should have known they would not take it well, but somehow I had still underestimated the speed and ferocity with which my parents would lose their minds when Danny came running home and spilled the whole ugly truth, choking on his own panic as he told them about the little meeting at the diner and the bombshell I had dropped right in the middle of his carefully spun web of lies and assumptions. It was barely an hour after I walked out of that grimy little diner, feeling the sticky booth's imprint still pressed into the backs of my legs, when my phone lit up like a Christmas tree with incoming calls and frantic texts, all from my mother. All in rapid succession, as if sheer volume could somehow undo the facts. I ignored the first 6 calls, calmly setting my phone face down on the coffee table and pouring myself a generous glass of cheap red wine, because if I was going to weather the storm I knew was coming, I might as well do it with something to dull the edge. When the 7th call came, I sighed, turned the volume down low, and finally answered, knowing it was better to face the eruption head-on rather than letting it fester any longer. The second I picked up, my mother's voice blasted through the speaker like a tornado, shrill and shaking, full of outrage and betrayal and the kind of righteous anger only a guilty person could summon without any sense of irony. "Heather and Cole, what the hell do you think you're doing?" she shrieked, as if I had run off with the family silver or set the house on fire instead of simply reminding them whose name was on the deed. I stayed silent for a beat, letting her words hang in the air, before answering as calmly as if I were discussing the weather. "What I should have done a long time ago," I said, my voice cool enough to frost the glass in my hand. Of course, she didn't hear a word past her own screeching, and within seconds my father was on the line too, the phone clattering as they must have fumbled with it between them, their voices overlapping in a chaotic chorus of accusations and demands. "How could I betray the family like this?" they screamed. "How could I be so cold, so calculating, so ungrateful after everything they had done for me?" It was like listening to a couple of clowns scream at a burning tent, blaming the match rather than the gasoline they had poured for years. When they paused to suck in oxygen like a pair of dying fish, I struck, my words slow and deliberate, each syllable a little scalpel cutting away the lies we had all lived under. "You want to talk about sacrifices?" I said, the wine glass trembling slightly in my hand though my voice never wavered. "Let's talk about sacrifices." I reminded them how they had insisted I stay home after high school to take care of Grandma June when she got sick, while Danny was handed a blank check to go to college 2 states away, partying his way through tuition and blowing every second chance he was given. I reminded them how I had turned down a full scholarship to a university 5 hours away because they said they could not handle the house without me, and how, even then, they somehow found the money to buy Danny a brand new sports car for his 19th birthday. I reminded them how, when Danny knocked up some poor girl he barely knew, it was me they guilt into babysitting his daughter every weekend so he could get his life together. Though somehow that never included showing up sober or paying so much as a dime in child support. And through it all, every time I voiced even a whisper of protest, every time I asked why it always had to be me, they would pull out the same worn-out phrase like a weapon, sharpened by years of repetition. Family means sacrifice, Heather. Now, standing at the edge of the battlefield they had spent decades creating, I finally threw their favorite weapon back at them. You taught me that family means sacrifice, I said, my voice slicing through their protests like a scalpel through rot. You just never thought it would mean you sacrificing for me. For a long moment, there was nothing but ragged breathing on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that is more honest than 1,000 screamed accusations, and then my mother's voice came back, lower now, trembling with desperate, ugly pleading. Heather, sweetheart, we're your parents. You don't want to do this. Please. Think about what you're doing to the family. There it was, the final move of the desperate, guilt, weaponized into a prayer. I almost laughed at how predictable it all was, how they still believed that just because they had used my love like a hammer all these years, they could still get me to build their house of lies one more time. I took a slow sip of wine, savoring the moment before delivering the final blow. You have a choice, I said, my voice flat and cold. Sign the papers. Put the house up as collateral. Or find another sucker. Then I hung up, the dial tone buzzing in my ear like a tiny, mechanical victory song. The morning after the final call with my parents, I woke up in my small condo surrounded by half-packed boxes and an air so heavy it felt like it was pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to believe I had really done it. I had won, if you could even call it that. The deed was still mine, untouched by signatures or false promises. The house no longer a bargaining chip in their endless games, but an anchor tethered firmly to me and me alone. No deal, no compromise, no second chances offered, and yet somehow, sitting there amid the cardboard chaos of my old life breaking apart at the seams, I felt less like a victor and more like a soldier who had won a battle only to realize the war had hollowed them out from the inside. My phone buzzed nonstop for the first few days. Angry texts from Danny, so vicious they bordered on pathetic, each message a little more desperate than the last, full of threats and accusations and the kind of language he used when he was backed into a corner and too stupid to find a graceful way out. My parents, for their part, went radio silent after one last voicemail that sounded like it had been written by a soap opera screenwriter, full of trembling sighs and phrases like heartbroken beyond words and no daughter of ours. I deleted it without listening to the end, though the bitterness in my mother's voice stayed with me longer than I would have liked, echoing in my skull during the long nights when sleep felt like a foreign concept. Moving into the house was an experience I can only describe as surreal, like walking into a wax museum of my own childhood memories where nothing had changed and yet everything was unbearably different. The furniture was the same, the wallpaper still a faded floral pattern that had been out of style since the 80s, the photos of Danny in all his shining moments still displayed proudly on every available surface, like a shrine to wasted potential. It felt like stepping into a life that had moved on without me, a life that had never really included me in the first place except as a footnote or an afterthought. I spent the first few nights sleeping on the lumpy couch in the living room because the bedroom felt too much like an invasion, too much like trespassing into a space that had been denied to me for so long it barely felt real now that it was mine. The silence in the house was oppressive, thick with the ghosts of 1,000 arguments and slights and moments of swallowed resentment. And more than once I found myself wondering if I had actually won anything at all or if I had just traded one kind of prison for another, this one built not of obligation but of memory and guilt and a deep, gnawing loneliness that no legal document could fix. It was on the third day, while aimlessly cleaning out drawers and cabinets, trying to banish the smell of old grease and broken dreams from the air, that I found it, a small, Yellowed envelope tucked into the back of a kitchen drawer behind a stack of expired coupons and takeout menus from restaurants that had long since gone out of business. My name was written on the front in Grandma June's shaky but unmistakable handwriting. The ink faded but still legible, a small beacon from the past sent forward like a time capsule for a moment just like this. Hands trembling slightly, I sat down at the kitchen table and opened the envelope, unfolding the letter inside with the kind of reverence normally reserved for sacred relics or live grenades. The letter was short, just a few paragraphs written in Grandma's no-nonsense style, but every word hit me harder than the last, each sentence peeling away another layer of the story I thought I understood. She wrote about how she had watched the way my parents treated me over the years, the way they used my loyalty against me, the way they built Danny up on a pedestal made of my sacrifices and my silence. She wrote about how she knew they would never change, not really, not unless someone forced them to see the consequences of their choices, and how she had decided to leave the house to me not out of favoritism, but out of grim, pragmatic hope. Hope that someday I would have something they could not take from me, something that would finally tip the balance in my favor. "I am sorry it had to be this way," she wrote, her pen strokes wobbling at the edges, "but I know you, Heather. I know you are strong enough to do what needs to be done, even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts." The letter ended without any grand declarations of love or forgiveness, just a simple line that hit me harder than any speech could have. "Freedom always comes at a cost, baby girl. Just make sure you don't mistake it for loneliness." I folded the letter carefully and set it back in the envelope, my hands steady now, the crushing weight in my chest easing just a little as I tucked it into the drawer again, as if putting it back would somehow make it easier to carry the burden it had handed me. I stood up, walked to the kitchen window, and stared out at the overgrown backyard, where the grass was knee-high and the fence was sagging under the weight of years of neglect. I stood there for a long time, longer than I can remember, watching the wind bend the tall weeds into rippling patterns that looked almost beautiful if you tilted your head just right. Somewhere deep inside, a tiny, stubborn voice whispered that I had done the right thing, that I had finally broken the cycle, that I had finally claimed something for myself without asking for permission or forgiveness. But another voice, just as loud, wondered if maybe all I had done was build a different kind of cage, one with my name on the deed, but with bars made of every choice that had led me here. I stayed at that window until the sun started to set, casting long shadows across the yard and the empty rooms behind me, and for the first time in my life, I realized that sometimes winning does not feel like victory at all. Sometimes it just feels like standing alone in a house full of ghosts, wondering if freedom was ever really the point.